So when I first watched the Svelte 3 presentation, I was like, well, you get the idea. Anyway, this thing looks great, really great. Let's take a closer look. So before we begin, I want to draw your attention to this presentation from You Gotta Love Frontend conference called Rethinking Reactivity, where Rich Harris explains in much more detail what Svelte is. So take a look at that video when you get the time. I will leave the link in the description below. So what is Svelte? Well, instead of trying to explain it in my own words, let's read a bit from the Svelte's official website. So Svelte is a component framework like React or Vue. Okay, so this part is pretty clear. Now here comes the complicated part. Traditional frameworks allow you to write declarative state-driven code, but there is a penalty. The browser must do extra work to convert those declarative structures into DOM operations, using techniques like virtual DOM diffing. Now this is a mouthful and a bit complicated. Actually, it's not explained very well, but Rich Harris explained it pretty simply in his conference, so I'm going to play a clip from that conference for you to see what the actual problem with virtual DOM is.
React was the first library that used a virtual DOM, and we're going to talk about how virtual DOM libraries work. A lot of you might already know what this code does, but let's talk through it anyway. This is a simple React application that has a single component called app, and it has some local state, count and name. And it has two functions that change that state, handle click, which uses set count, and handle input, which uses set name. And then at the bottom it returns a slice of virtual DOM. And as that state changes, that virtual DOM is regenerated each time, and then React's job is to reconcile what came before with what came after. So let's see what this process looks like. First we look at the top level element. It was a div, it's still a div, so we keep it. Then we need to look at the attributes. It had a class name, app, it still has a class name, app, so we keep it. Then we look at the children. It had an h1, it still has an h1, so we keep it. Then we look what's inside the h1, some text, it hasn't changed, we keep it. Look at the input, it's still an input, we keep it. The value hasn't changed, we keep it. Look at a button, it's still a button, we keep it. Its text has changed, so we need to apply that to the DOM. All that work to change a 4 to a 5. As engineers, we should be offended at all that inefficiency, but that's not the bad part. The bad part is that we keep running this code over and over again. Every time there is any state change at all, we need to redeclare these functions that close over that local state. The problem here is that React doesn't have any understanding of the values flowing through your app. It treats it as a black box. In other words, by any reasonable definition of the word, React is not reactive. Or as John Lindquist said, React is a terrible name for React.js.
So I hope this gives you an idea of what the problem with virtual DOM is. So what does Svelte do? Well, Svelte is a framework, but it's also a compiler. What that means is that Svelte is going to take that code of yours and compile it to just pure JavaScript. And that means that you won't have any dependencies. You would have just your bundle.js file without any dependencies. Unlike Vue or React, which will of course depend on Vue or React or Angular and so on. So you will have a small bundle size, and because Svelte runs at build time, converting your components into highly efficient imperative code that surgically updates the DOM, that means that Svelte is very, very fast. So it goes on here that the first version of Svelte was just proof of concept, then the second version was just tidying things up a bit, and the version 3 is a significant overhaul. So our focus for the last 5 or 6 months has been on delivering an outstanding developer experience. It is now possible to write components with significantly less boilerplate than you find anywhere else. Try the brand new tutorial, so I urge you to try this tutorial. It's really great, and see what we mean. So if you're familiar with other frameworks, we think you'll be pleasantly surprised. So I am familiar with them, and I'm really surprised, and I'm really excited about this project. So that's about it for introduction, I think, and I think it's time to install Svelte and play a little bit with the code. So now we are just going to go through few basic Svelte code examples, but before we do and before we install Svelte, I just want to show you this page. So on Svelte Dev Tutorial Basics, you have this interactive tutorial which you can use, and it will guide you more in depth than this video through the Svelte code. So just click on next right here and it will guide you through the tutorial. Also there is something called Svelte for new developers, which is coming soon, so it's not done yet, but it's made for people that are not comfortable with Node.js, command line, webpack, rollup, parcel and so on. So if you're a new developer, keep an eye on this page. Anyway, let's get started, and first of all let's install Svelte. So as you can see, installing Svelte is pretty easy. You just do npx digit svelte.js template, and we are going to install it in Svelte directory. And you just cd into it and do npm install. Okay, once this is done, you can just do npm run dev and open http localhost 5000, and that's it. So as you can see, Svelte boilerplate is pretty simple. You got src folder for your source files, and those source files are going to get compiled into this public folder, and that's about it. Also, you got this rollup config. This is because Svelte out of the box doesn't use webpack, but it actually uses rollup. Okay, so in main.js file, you define your application. You set the target for that application. Currently, it's set to body, so the whole document is actually going to be the Svelte application. Of course, you can change this to be whatever you want. You got these props. We are not going to be talking about props in this episode. Actually, in this video, I'm just going to save this and let's start coding. So in app.svelte, you start writing your code. So this is actually, let's call it a root component. And as you can see, this is very similar to Vue. You got your script tag, you got your style tag, and you write your HTML down here. You just don't have the template tag, which you would have in Vue. Okay, so in script you would write your your JavaScript, and let's say, for example, in Vue you would have to define your data, so in the special data method and so on. Right here your data is just your data, so your variables, your objects, your arrays. You don't need to define them in any special way. So you would just write something like let name is equal to nothing. So we want to set the name to be nothing, and right here you would write something like, so what I want to show you is binding. So I want to bind that name to the input element, and to do that you would just do something like this, input, and let me just clear this out. So we want to bind the value of that input to the name variable. Okay, and right here it says hello name. Okay, save this, check out our browser, and if I write something like John here, as you can see, it automatically gets displayed on the page. So this is great. This is how you would bind elements to variables, arrays, and so on. Okay, so let's define names now. Okay, now we defined our data, so it's going to be names, and if we want to display them right here, we can do an UL tag, and then very similarly to Vue, but I actually like this method better, actually this way, or this syntax better, because it reminds me of kind of a classical way you would do for each statements and so on. So you would do each names as name, right? You would do li tag in here, and then you would just display a name. And you would end that with each. So it's a little bit more code than you would do in Vue, but this is much readable to me than writing something like v4 and so on, right? Okay, so we got names as name, and now our names should appear in this unordered list. So if I refresh the page, as you can see, Anne, Jack, and John. What else you can do right here is you can do something like else and do maybe li. So there are no names. What this means is if this array turns out to be empty, then Svelte is just going to display this. And this works automatically. So you don't have to write any logic for something like this. So right now, of course, if I refresh the page, we get Anne, Jack, John. But if I go right here and remove those names, save it, now I just get there are no names. So this is also great. Okay, so I added our names back. And what I want to do now is I want to add a name to that list via our application. So right now here, I'm just going to create a button. And I'm going to say to that button on click, add name. So very similarly to this bind directive. So add name, and we are going to call that button add name. Okay, so on click, we are going to run a function. So we need to define that function, and the function is going to be called add name. Okay, so once you create that function, what you could do, well, actually, I just want to show you a very important thing about Svelte. So you would do something like this. So names, push. So we want to push that name into that array, name, right? So we want to push the name into our array. So if I do this, right, go to my browser, refresh this. If I do something like Steve right here, click add name. As you can see, nothing happened. But actually, let me open up my console and do something like this right here. So I'm just going to console log out names array, right? Save this, go to my browser. Let me make this bigger for you. Okay, so if I refresh this page right now and do Steve, click add name, as you can see, Anne, Jack, John, and Steve is in our array. So this is weird, but it's not displaying right here. Also, I can add another name, so Bob, for example. Click add name, and as you can see, the Bob is added, but it's not displayed. So this is because Svelte depends on assignments. So you need to assign something to a variable to get displayed on the page, to get that automatic reactivity. So how do we do that? Well, the easiest way in our case, in this case, would be to just do something like you go right here and you do names equal names, right? Save this because now you are adding again to this variable. And if we refresh this page and try this again, so Steve, click add name, and as you can see, Steve is displayed right here. Now, this code doesn't look too great, but what you can do if you are using ES6, and you probably need to use ES6 with Svelte, you can do something like this with spread operators. So you would just do names equals names name, and that's it. Now you have one liner, and this should also work. So if we go right here, refresh the page, say Bob, add name, and as you can see, this works. Now I'm just going to paste a little bit of styling right here. We are going to create a model, and actually I'm going to show you how to use if statement in Svelte. First of all, I'm going to define my data, of course, and that data is going to be model open. And this we will set to be, of course, false. Okay, so let's create our model down here. So I'm just going to create a div called model. And in it, I'm just going to write h4. And also I'm just going to add a button right here. And I'm going to say to that button on click, toggle model. Okay, so we are going to toggle the model, and outside of the model I'm going to say I'm going to create another button which is going to contain the same function, and it's going to be called open model, and this one in the model itself is going to be called close model. Okay, so now we got our structure set up. All we need to do is define this function right here, and this function is just going to be, since we set up our data to be model open, which is currently false, let's do it like this. So function, and we say toggle model to be model open. Open is going to be not equal to model open. Okay, great. So this is it. So whenever you click toggle model, this is going to be opposite of what it currently is, right? So pretty simple. It's just a simple toggle. And now to finish this off, what we need to do is we need to use the if directive. So we do if model open, and then we just close it here like this. Not like this, but like this, right? So that's about it. I think this should work. Let's just test it out. Save this, go to our browser, refresh the page. Model open is not defined, so I screwed something up, which is not a surprise. So model open, model open. Great, let's test it out again. Oh yeah, so I forgot to say let model open, so I actually didn't define that variable. And I also had a syntax error. Okay, let's refresh it now. Great. So now, as you can see, if I click open model, I get that model. Hi, I'm a model. And if I click close model, I close it. Open it, close it. So you can see how this works. Pretty simple. Okay, so I think we are going to stop here. I just want to leave you with just one more cool thing that comes right out of the box with Svelte, and that's transitions. So you can do something like this on this model, right? So let's say we want to fade it in when that model opens. So you would just do in fade. Fade is equal to, so you define the duration, and it's in milliseconds, so 500 milliseconds. Now this isn't going to work right away because we actually need to import fade from Svelte's transitions. So you would do import fade from Svelte transition. Okay, so let's save this and check it out if it works. So if I go right here, refresh this page, click open model, as you can see, it just fades in like this. Close model, it disappears. Fades, disappears. So let's do something even more cooler than this, let's also import fly from transitions, and then right here you can do out fly. So we want to fly it out, and we're just going to do the same as this. So duration is going to be 500. But you also need to define on which axis this is going to fly out. So I'm just going to set this to be y-axis, and it's going to be minus, let's say, 40 pixels. Okay, save this. Let's test it out. Now, if I refresh it and click on open model, as you can see, it fades in. But if I click close model, as you can see, it goes out a bit and then fades out. Pretty cool. So you can do all sorts of things out with transitions right out of the box. Now, this is all just a small part of what Svelte can do. You definitely need to check out the documentation, get acquainted with the API, and subscribe to my channel, because I'm going to have at least a few series about Svelte in the future on it. So watch out for that. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Svelte, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.